Today in my lecture I wish to approach a very significant, though somewhat forgotten event in the history of world religions, particularly with regard to the arrival of Asian religions to the West. I'm referring, of course, to the 1893 World Parliament of Religions. I will begin my lecture then with a description of this unique event. From there, I will proceed to focus on the theosophical tone which dominated the way Asian religions were presented at the Parliament. The World Parliament of Religions was an interfaith event held in the city of Chicago between the 11th and 27th of September 1893. The Parliament constituted the first formal gathering in the modern era between delegates of the great religions, East and West. It was held as part of the World's Columbian Exposition, an event dedicated to the celebration of the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in America. And its aim was to demonstrate Western world's technological as well as cultural superiority. The total number of 194 representatives participated in the parliament, of which 43 were Asians. Among these were delegates of different schools of Buddhism, Hinduism, and the Brahmo Samaj, which was the Hindu reform movement. Protestant Christianity, not surprisingly, held the largest delegation at the parliament, and not far behind it, in second place, was the Catholic Church delegation. Judaism was also present, and so was Islam. There was also a significant presence of some of the new religions of the era. Christian Science, Spiritualism, and of course, the Theosophical Society. The presence of the Theosophical Society at the Parliament was in fact quite impressive. Among the delegates were Vice President of the Society, William Quan Judge, Annie Besant, and Isabel Cooper Oakley. Henry Steele Olcott, the President of the Society, sent a short telegram to be read at the opening session by Besant. There were also other delegates present with close connection to Theosophy. Among these, if to name just some, were Muhammad Russell Webb, an American representing Islam and the former Theosophist, Professor Chakravarti of India, a Theosophist representing Hinduism, and Angarika Dharmapala from Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka, representing Theravada Buddhism. The initial intention of the Parliament's organizer was to focus on those points of agreement between the various religions. The main idea was that of a universal religion, one under the umbrella of liberal Protestant Christianity. The consequences, though, as we will see, were quite different from what was expected. At this point, I would like to turn to a few examples in order to showcase the theosophical agenda that in many ways, as I've already mentioned, came to dominate the Parliament, at least in regard to the way Asian religions were introduced. In other words, Asian religions, as presented by prominent Asian delegates, carried a significant theosophical nuance. That included, among other things, an emphasis put upon the affinity between science and religion, with a tendency of presenting Asian religions as being scientific in their nature, the idea of Asia as a continent bearing an ancient universal wisdom, the idea of Eastern religions as equal or even superior to Christianity, the theme of a universal brotherhood, and the common use of Western terminology, Protestant, liberal, and Hermetic, in relation to Asian ideas and doctrines. I will begin my example with Angarika Dharmapala, which you can see here, who represented, as I said before, Theravada Buddhism, called at the Parliament Southern Buddhism. Dharmapala was born and raised in Ceylon. In his youth, he joined, after meeting Madame Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott, in 1880, the Theosophical Society. He was, for a period of time, Olcott's translator, and had also cooperated with the colonel in the project of reviving Buddhism in Ceylon. In his speeches before the Parliament, Dharmapala emphasized over and over the idea of the universality of Buddhism. He described Buddhism as a scientific religion, one which is not based on dogma and blind faith, but on means of rational discourse. In a speech he gave on September 11th, titled "The World's Debt to Buddha," he described the foundation of Buddhism as the greatest religion revolution that the world had known, the Buddha in the Ramphal speech is said to be, notice his terminology, the enlightened Messiah of the world, one who walked the face of earth, surrounded by a community of holy men some 600 years before Jesus of Nazareth. In a different part of the same speech, the Ramphal declares that the essence of the vast teachings of the Buddha is the entire obliteration of all that is evil and the perfect consummation of all that is good and pure. And he concludes his speech with the following words: this forms the fundamental teaching of the Buddha, universal love and sympathy with all mankind. And it is for this reason that Buddha inculcated the necessity of self-reliance and independent thought. That's Dharmapala's words. Some of the themes and terminology that Dharmapala used in those speeches, as one can assume, were not taken from Theravada Buddhism, but were most likely inspired, among other influences, by Theosophical doctrines which Dharmapala had a close acquaintance with. Dharmapala became famous when a few days after the parliament he converted a New York Jew by the name of Karl T. Strauss to Buddhism, in what was probably the first conversion to Buddhism on American soil. Later, Dharmapala occasionally revisited America to lecture to various audiences. It would be safe to say that he played a significant role in the popularization of Buddhism in the US at the beginning of the 20th century. Theosophists could also be found among the Japanese delegation to the parliament. The two light participants and translators, Noguchi Zenshiro and Hirai Kinza, were both Theosophists and were also engaged in bringing Colonel Henry Steele Olcott to Japan. But it is Zen master of the Rinzai school, delegate Suen Shako, who I wish to turn to now. Zen master Suen Shako's original speech, written in Japanese, was meant to be a very technical exposition of the Buddhist doctrine of codependent origination. However, the actual English speech, given at the parliament, was one very much in accordance with Theosophical discourse. I will read to you part of it and you can judge for yourself. I'm quoting from Suen Shako's speech. Not only Buddha alone, he says, but Jesus Christ, as well as Confucius, taught about universal love and fraternity. We also acknowledge the glory of universal brotherhood. Then let us, the true followers of Buddha, the true followers of Jesus Christ, the true followers of Confucius, and the followers of truth, unite ourselves for the sake of helping the helpless and living glorious lives of brotherhood under the control of truth. Later in his speech, Suen Shako speaks of Buddhism as a universal religion, one in perfect harmony, in his words, with science and philosophy. Quite an interesting terminology to be used by a 19th century Japanese Zen master, one would think. Suen Shako, though a forgotten name today, has played an important role in the history of the arrival of Zen Buddhism to the West, as we will soon see. When the parliament ended, Shako spent a week at the house of Paul Karros, a German-American author and philosopher who also attended the parliament, during which the two discussed philosophy and comparative religion. When Shako returned to Japan, the two stayed in close contact. In 1897, Shako sent one of his young disciples to the United States to stay at Paul Karros' house in order for the two to work together on a translation to English of the Tao Te Ching, the Taoist classic. During that time, the young Japanese was also working on his first major work in English called Outlines of Mahayana Buddhism. The name of this young anonymous man was Daisetsu Tetaro Suzuki, known as D.T. Suzuki. In the years to come, Suzuki would become one of the most important influential figures in the 20th century in regard to the introduction of Asian religions, especially Zen Buddhism, to the West. His long-time career can be seen as a link between the Parliament of Religion at the end of the 19th century and another important event in the short history of Asian religions in America, the American counterculture of the 1960s. Historian Arnold Toynbee have said of Suzuki's introduction of Zen Buddhism to the West that it will later be compared with the discovery of nuclear energy. A fact perhaps lesser known about Suzuki but indeed very relevant for our purpose, is that he was deeply fascinated through his adult life with theosophy. Suzuki's American wife, Beatrice Lane Suzuki, was a member of the Tokyo Lodge of the Theosophical Society, and Suzuki himself had later joined the society as a member. He is reported to have been an admirer of Madame Blavatsky, the founder of the society. He described, for instance, Blavatsky's 1889 book, The Voice of the Silence, as manifesting, in his own words, the real Mahayana Buddhism. And he believed that undoubtedly Blavatsky was in some way initiated into the deeper side of Mahayana Buddhism. In his many books about Zen, Suzuki was almost obsessed, one might say, in presenting Zen as being universal, scientific, spiritual, and in accordance with modernity. He thought, for example, that the American philosopher and mystic Ralph Waldo Emerson had taught Zen, and that the 18th century Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg he called Buddha of the North. It was Suzuki, of course, who translated Suan Shako's earlier Parliament of Religious Speech into English, and the one responsible for its theosophical twist. There is little evidence that Suzuki, at that time of the Parliament, was already familiar with theosophy. We do know, however, that Henry Steele Olcott, together with Angarika Dharmapala, were already very active at that time with Buddhist groups in Japan, a fact which could possibly have been an early source of inspiration for the young Suzuki. By now we've seen that the way Asian religions were introduced to the American public during and also after the World Parliament of Religions had been influenced largely by Western and theosophical concepts, no less perhaps than by the original traditions which it claimed to represent. One possible response in relation to this fact would be that of contempt or even disdain towards those westernized, allegedly easy-to-swallow versions of ancient Asian traditions marketed now to the American public. But I believe this approach had been used over and over, and personally I find it a little too easy. I would like to suggest a different option, claiming that the kind of presentation used at the Parliament does not necessarily have to be taken as light or superficial. The Theosophists, no doubt, had been quite successful in popularizing Asian religions in the West, possibly the first one to succeed in this project, at least in America. Earlier important attempts, like those of the American transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, and others, did not and could not exceed the confines of a small literary elite, though they certainly paved the way for future developments. I believe, though, that the actual turning point in regard to the American attitude towards Eastern spirituality, so to speak, can be found in the World Parliament of Religions, perhaps more than anywhere else, when Asian delegates presented their doctrines face-to-face with the American public for the first time. The use of some of the prominent figures among them, such as Dharmapala and Suen Shako, and also others whom I did not mention here, of a theosophical and Western agenda, and the synthesis that was created following this use may not be one loyal to that authentic spirit of Theravada Buddhism or Zen for that matter. If one can ever put their finger on such a spirit, which I personally doubt, but it nevertheless could have been the most efficient way at the time of presenting these foreign traditions and cultures, and it is that which opened the door to the flow of ideas, practices, and teachers arriving in the US from Asia in large numbers in the following years. And perhaps this introduction of Asian religions, as we saw in the Parliament, was, after all, loyal, at least in a way, to the original spirit of the tradition. For in Buddhism, as some of you know, there is the concept of upaya, which translates as expedient means. And that is, I believe, more or less what Angarika Dharmapala, T.D. Suzuki, and others chose to do. They used the best suitable means for fulfilling their mission, which was introducing Buddhism to the West. By that, they've opened up the way for the possible arrival to the West, that is, if you must insist, of also more authentic versions of Asian religions later on. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So we have quite some time for the discussion. So are there any questions? Judith?
I was wondering, do we know what was the relationship between Suzuki and Edward Conze, since Edward Conze, who translated so many Buddhist scriptures for the West, also had a great admiration for Blavatsky. And I mean, as you said, this afterlife of the discourse of the late 19th century in the American counterculture of the 60s was significant. So if you could comment also on this scholarly...
Well, to tell the truth, I don't know about the relationship between them, so I don't know what to say, but if anyone else does, I would be happy to hear that. I don't know. I don't know about the relation between the two. No, sorry.
More questions?
Yeah, not question, but answer for question. Suzuki is not, actually Suzuki does not like Theosophy so much as his wife, Beatrice, because he followed his wife's direction. Well, he want to help his wife's project of the Theosophical Lodge opening in Japan, but I would think that he's not so fond of the teaching of Theosophy. He wrote it in his letter to his wife. I think he knows that fact.
I didn't get the last sentence.
Suzuki is rather fond of Swedenborg. He absorbed his idea into his interpretation of Zen Buddhism, and it is very creative and interesting. But Theosophy is rather a mixture of it's not good product. Yeah, mixed. And hodgepodge and he also critical Krishnamurti. He wrote that he's a non-illusion and too much distracting for the Westerners. He wrote that. And I think it is difficult to label someone as a theosophist.
Yeah,
For example, he says that Noguchi and Hirai were theosophists, but I don't think Noguchi is not so. Hirai saw some ideas of syncretic model of theosophy for his philosophy of synthetic religion, but the influence, the degree of influence is difficult to
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of these figures were ambivalent toward theosophy in many ways, including Dharmapala, which during his life he turned his back to theosophy at some point. So they were affected by theosophy, they were inspired by it, but yes, maybe it would be more true to say that they weren't strict theosophists, not all of them for sure.
And one more thing to add. Japanese Buddhist influenced not only by theosophy, but also German ideology, German philosophy of idealism. And so was some Western philosophy. And Shakuso's discourse might not be only theosophical, but also reflects such a wide variety of Western influences.
Yeah, I do Shakuso's. Maybe it wasn't clear in my paper, but I didn't mean that he was a theosophist himself. He was affected by some ideas. I referred to especially to his disciple, to Suzuki, not to him himself.
And it is a good thing to watch the theosophical nuance in the world parliament. But there are some other universal religions influence, like Unitarian and Swedenborg, and I think a more complex influence on the world parliament religion.
I totally agree. I wanted to concentrate on one aspect, but of course there were also other discourses in other aspects in the parliament, some of them very different from theosophy. Yes, so yes, I agree with your comment.
I just want to underline that because Vivekananda is the same case. He was not very amused about the Theosophical Society, but he also used this rhetorics of the unity of mankind, and that the Asian religions are not minor religions, but sources of primordial wisdom. If this is theosophical, then of course there was this theosophical talk. But these ideas did not belong to Theosophy only.
His ideas of Vivekananda.
Huh?
Vivekananda's ideas, you mean?
Yes.
Yes.
And this idea of unity of mankind and universal religion was probably propagated very loudly by the Theosophists, but it wasn't an invention of the Theosophists.
It wasn't an invention, I agree, but in Vivekananda's case, it's interesting to see his reinvention of yoga after the parliament, which was also partly, I think, inspired by not only Theosophy, but Theosophy as a dominant new religious movement of that era. I think it was inspired largely by it, or partially by it. Okay, so, but it is hard to say. Okay.
Yeah, I'd just like to reflect upon a little bit on Dharmapala's, the universal appeal, referring to universal appeal.
Can you speak a little louder?
I just want to, reflect upon what you said about Dharmapala's claim that the universal appeal of Buddhism. I also spoke the last evening that actually it's interesting. The speech he delivered at the Chicago, and it's obvious that that he made this universalist sort of claim. And when you look at other writings, and which are more the nationalist oriented, and so that you see quite a contradictory the legacy. So he was soon to become a kind of champion of the nationalist cause, and so there was a kind of tension between the Steel Olcott and the Dharmapala. So then Dharmapala became quite critical about the Olcott's the universalist orientation, whereas Olcott was critical about this nationalist orientation of Dharmapala. So it's I think so this is not something can be reduced to the sort of personal choices, but I think you have to understand in the historical context where especially in the case of Buddhism. So one of the challenges was to assert their place in the face of the whole process of European expansion, where there was a kind of the dominance of Western knowledge, and so you have to define your own presence in relation to this dominant discourse of Western science, and right. So therefore, actually this, even when you look at Dharmapala's historical writing, so one of the main objectives was to prove that this the Sinhala people, so they had the long history, and probably so they built a higher level of civilization when the white man in Britain, so they were just at the level of the savage. So that's a kind of the attempt to be compared with the dominant position, and this this universalist appeal of Buddhism is a kind of how do you say the tool for them right? So that's I mean, I just
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
More questions?
Just to comment on what you said before, I think Vivekananda, first you have to view him as the sort of the Bengali Renaissance. I mean, it's much more important, and I think his role in the Parliament of Religion was, I don't know, but maybe you can comment about it, but even was stronger than the Buddhist. I mean, the Buddhist, the Advaita Vedanta influence after that came like, and he came from nowhere. And nobody heard about him before. That's one thing. And just another comment that maybe you remember, but after that there were two attempts to make two small parliament of religion in India, and one of them, the one that represented the Judaism, was a member of the Theosophical Society. I don't remember, I sent you that, but I don't remember his name. He wrote this guy from Calcutta.
Isaac.
Isaac, yeah. And he gave kind of lectures, and it's very interesting because they made like in India to Parliament of Religion as well.
Okay, and about your comment about Vivekananda, it's completely true. I think Vivekananda was the biggest celebrity, so to speak, of the Parliament. Yeah, and he was he had a very large influence. Afterwards, he stayed in the U.S. for a long period of time, lecturing all over. He built the Vedanta Society, which had branches after a few years all over the States, and still does, with figures like Aldous Huxley later on, then people of the counterculture, prominent figures of the 60s countercultures joining it. So yes, he had a very big influence in the U.S. in spreading what he called Vedanta. Yeah, of course, it wasn't Orthodox Vedanta. Had all kinds of influences, but yes, he was. I think he had a bigger influence than Dharmapala or the Buddhist participants in the U.S. in the period right after the Parliament. Yeah.
The main point is that in terms of the Bengali Renaissance and the influence of Christianity in India as part of which led to the Parliament of Religion of like it's two direction.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Two direction influence. Yeah.
I actually have. No, I have one question.
Sorry, Marco.
We have some time. So no, I am a bit curious about the role of Isabel Cooper Oakley. Who I think is a very interesting figure in the early history of the Theosophical Society, but she has been practically studied by nobody. Interestingly enough, she played a very important role in the early development of the Theosophical Society in Italy. And she's one of those figures that you have, especially in the early history of the Theosophical Society, those women missionaries going around from one country to the other to spread the good news of the Theosophical Society and help local branches to be established and to develop. So I was wondering a little bit about her role at the Parliament, whether you saw anything in the records that tells us something about what she did and whether she was active or whether she was just attending but not being particularly prominent.
She was. I know she was certainly attending. I don't know. I didn't read anything of her that was. I don't know if she actually gave a speech. The Theosophical Society had a separate congress. They were given a separate congress at the Parliament, and I think they all spoke, including her. But I didn't see anything that I can recall that surrounded these subjects from her. I can check that, but not that I can.
And is there a record of if she spoke?
Yeah, there is a record of everything. Yes.
Okay.
It's on the net.
I would be curious to see.
Yeah, I can
that's one of the early figures of the Theosophical Society that has been studied the least. I think nobody knows anything about Isabel Cooper Oakley, but she's an interesting figure. Thank you. So I think we're done with the discussion, so we can move.